Okay, it is 2 o'clock. We are now live on Facebook, and this webinar is being recorded on Zoom as well. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jinan. I am the ADC National Organizer based out here in Washington, D.C. Today, we are joined by a panel of experts who are going to discuss the implications of the annexation of Palestine upcoming this week on July 1st. As always, we are very grateful to all of our speakers for being with us, as well as everyone who has signed up. I know a lot of people are still signing on right now. You can also watch us on Facebook, just facebook.com/ADC National. And the recording will be on our Facebook after the program in case you miss any of it. If you have any questions throughout the program, please feel free to put them in the chat box. I will monitor that for our speakers, as well as the Q&A box. We also did have a number of questions that were submitted through our Zoom registration form. So if any of those questions are not explained or addressed in the webinar, then I will toss them out to our speakers to answer them. So again, ADC, we're very happy to be able to host this program, as well as all the other programs we've been doing during this pandemic. Please join us and support us, become a member, go to our website, adc.org, to get more information and to see events that we have that are upcoming. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Omar Baddar, who's going to be the moderator and who's going to introduce our speakers for today. Thank you, Omar.
Thank you so much, Jinan, and thanks to the ADC for putting this together. Before we dive into annexation, I just want to acknowledge something that happened last week, and that is the killing of Ahmed Ariqat at an Israeli checkpoint when his car crashed at the checkpoint. He was killed on the day of his sister's wedding and 2 weeks before his own wedding. When he was killed, he was actually on the way to the hair salon to pick up his sister and his mother leading up to that wedding. And so a family's day of celebration turned into tragedy fairly quickly. And even though we don't know why the car crashed exactly at the checkpoint, we do know that the Israeli authorities lied when they claimed that Ahmed had gotten out of his car and had headed towards the soldiers when they felt under threat and shot him. When we actually look at the unblurred video that has emerged of the incident, it's pretty clear that Ahmed was shot as soon as he was trying to get out of his car. And it looked like he was about to raise his hands to clearly show that he's not a threat. And I think that that's a really important detail that gets lost quite frequently in the discussion that has happened over the past week about this. And it's also equally important to note that Ahmed was denied medical care. An ambulance was prevented from reaching him, and he laid on the ground for an hour and a half. So it's really difficult to find words to describe what happened apart from a murder. And a murder that happens, unfortunately, all too frequently under Israeli occupation and apartheid. And one important note on this is that the Israeli military had no business being there in the first place. This was happening between one Palestinian town and another. And the military was there to effectively facilitate a permanent occupation that is now about to be called annexation, presumably soon, which is precisely what we're here to discuss and what that annexation actually means. Whether the declaration comes this week or not, whether it gets announced on July 1st, whether it gets announced as a small annexation or a big annexation, the announcement is entirely separate from the fact that annexation is already a reality on the ground. The Palestinian territories have already been taken over by Israel, and Palestinians live under Israeli control. And to get a better sense of what the implications of annexation are, I think we are joined by a really incredible panel. We have Diana Buttu. She's a political analyst based in Palestine and a policy advisor to Al-Shabaka, and is also a former legal advisor to PLO Chairman Mahmoud Abbas. We're also joined by Josh Ruebner, who is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's Justice and Peace program and a managing director at American Muslims for Palestine. And he's also the author of 2 books, Shattered Hopes, Obama's Failure to Broker Israeli-Palestinian Peace, and Israel, Democracy or Apartheid State. And last but not least is Miko Peled. Many of you, I'm sure, already know him, Israeli-American human rights activist and the author of General Sun, A Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. So thank you all for joining us for this conversation. I'm wondering if we can start with you, Diana. There are a lot of people who say that because annexation is already a reality on the ground, that somehow an announcement of annexation is not particularly consequential, which is a view that I disagree with. I'm wondering what your take on it is, of sort of what annexation will mean on the ground for Palestinians.
Look, Harman, I think that we can't underestimate what annexation means on the ground. As you started off by saying, the West Bank is littered with checkpoints and roadblocks, about 700 of them. And the reason that there are checkpoints is because there are Israeli settlements. And we also have separate roads for Israeli settlers. We have Palestinians who are under attack constantly by Israeli settlers as well. The problem with annexation is, yes, this has been going on for 53 years. It's that now it's being absolutely formalized. And unless there is a mechanism in place to hold Israel accountable, we're going to continue to see much more of this. So, in Israel, there's always been two strands of thought. One strand of thought is do whatever it is that you want to do and just do it quietly. And this is what led to all of these settlements being built and all of these checkpoints that are in place. But then there's another strand of thought, which Netanyahu believes, which is that you don't have to do it quietly anymore because nobody's been stopping us. And so his strand of thought is continue to inflict harm, but not only continue to inflict harm, make sure that it gets the international stamp of approval. And that's why we should be pushing back against this so that it doesn't get this international stamp of approval and so that we can start highlighting what Israel's been doing for the past 53 years.
And Josh, I know that you've worked a lot on the Hill in relation to Israel-Palestine. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about, there are a lot of voices right now who are talking, about how this is unadvisable for Israel to announce annexation. And effectively, it sounds like to tell Israel to not declare annexation is merely to tell it to conceal what is already a reality on the ground. Can you talk sort of about the mood in Washington and what the conversation in Washington is like in relation to annexation?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Omar, because I think that it's helping to drive the partisan wedge that we've seen between Republicans and Democrats on the issue of Palestinian human rights emerge over several years. And in particular, regarding annexation, we've seen how the Trump administration has given Israel the green light to go ahead with the annexation and this plan that it finally released in January of this year, where basically Trump okayed the idea of Israel annexing up to 30% of the West Bank, even in the absence of any official negotiations taking place. So that stance has been firmly supported by the Republican caucus in Congress. In fact, you had numerous letters from both the Senate and the House expressing the viewpoint that it was Israel's quote unquote sovereign decision and its decision alone as to what land it wants to annex. The Democrats, though, on the other hand, even though they've opposed Israeli annexation for the most part, they've done it so far in a very watered down and weak way. So while they've expressed opposition to it, exactly like what was said before, there have been no consequences put forward as of now to Israel's actions. And in fact, there was a decent letter that was written by Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland back in May that actually threatens Israel with consequences to its US funding if it proceeded with annexation. But under pressure, that was watered down and that consequence was stripped out of the letter. So that it wound up being an incredibly bland statement of, oh, pretty please don't annex these lands. We don't think it's good for you. Not to say anything of Palestinian rights.
Certainly that is a big problem here, is that the victims seem to be entirely invisible in these conversations. Certainly a lot more focus is about whether this is good or bad for Israel, which is really incredible. It's rarely part of the discussion in almost any other crime that you can think of where the victims just don't factor in. Miko, you heard Diana talk earlier about the sort of two strands of thoughts within Israeli society about the extent to which you can be brazen about annexation. Can you talk a little bit about the mood in Israel and whether you feel like Netanyahu's approach of just saying we can do and take whatever we want without consequence, how that is received by Israeli society right now?
Well, it's received very well. I mean, obviously he keeps being reelected and reelected and reelected, so it's being received very well. They voted for him in order for him to do this. So it's the people pushing him or supporting his perspective to begin with. And I think this is what Israel is about today. I mean, whereas before there was this desire to conceal and hide and pretend and, you know, have this kind of a nice peace-loving face, like Diana said, they don't need it anymore. They threw it out because they know they don't need it, and they can act with impunity. And I think it's important for people, as they discuss this issue, to remember we're not talking about, or we shouldn't talk about this as though this was, you know, a legitimate, normal state that has done something wrong. We need to see this in the larger context as an illegal entity that has been acting with impunity for over 7 decades and now continues to make things worse, you know, for the Palestinians, as it has done for over 7 decades. Sure, the annexation is going to make things much more difficult for the Palestinians who live in that. And also we see every time there's this kind of a, whether it's the annexation of East Jerusalem in 1980, the annexation of the Golan Heights, and then later on, you know, more recently, Trump's moving of the embassy and recognizing these annexations and so on, it creates a bolder, more violent, more aggressive Israeli military. It creates a lot more, you know, we can see the statistics, more people are being arrested, people are being killed. I mean, so they act with even more impunity if that's something we can imagine. But Israeli society is quite happy. I mean, some people think, yes, we need to be a little bit slower, perhaps, but you know, they voted for Netanyahu to do exactly this, and the settler groups, which is, you know, it's defined as the right bloc, which is really Netanyahu's probably most important constituency. They're pushing this harder and harder and harder. They want to see what they call the, you know, the imposition of Israeli sovereignty on all of the West Bank, not just bits and pieces. And again, in terms of Israeli society, I think the annexation of the Jordan River Valley, which is what we're talking about right now, which is about a third, the kind of the eastern third of the West Bank, has been expected. It's not even in terms of the consensus, it's not really considered occupied or the West Bank, because it's, you know, it's been considered part of the consensus anyway. So I think Israelis are quite happy to see this, and I think this is, again, it's part of a larger project here, which is to take and legitimize the taking of more and more of Palestine by Israel.
And just out of curiosity, Miko, do you envision that? How do Palestinians fit in that final vision? Are they forever a subjugated people living under Israeli control, or is the dream to push them out one day, waiting for another event that could justify a second Nakba, if you can call it that? I'm curious of what you think is the plan for Palestinians in the long term.
Well, they said it. They say it very clear. They've said it very clearly. I mean, the representatives of the Israeli government have said this very, very clearly. The Palestinians are going to be given three options. The first option is to remain as good residents without rights. They'll be able to vote for local elections, whatever, things like that, but they will have no rights as citizens. Or they can fight and die, or they can leave and they say be compensated, but of course we know Israel, you know, never compensates. So those are the three options the Palestinians are going to be given, and that's exactly what I think what's going to happen now as soon as this annexation or application of sovereignty, as they call it, takes place. These are the options the Palestinians are going to be given.
Diana, I know that, you know, we've had many conversations before where I think both of us are fairly critical of the way the Palestinian leadership has pursued the path of fighting for Palestinian freedom. And now that Israel is effectively declaring apartheid as the permanent goal quite openly, what do you see are the options for the way Palestinians can respond? What do you think of the current Palestinian response, and what do you think it can or should be from here?
Well, the current Palestinian leadership's response has been twofold. One is to try to stop the annexation, and they've done this by openly, and this is for the first time ever, It's taken them a very long time to do this, but they've openly called for sanctions. And the second thing that they've done is that they have indicated that they're cutting off all collaboration, any coordination with Israel. And I have to say that that comes, there's a price for that. And the price is that because Israel has turned everything into a security issue, including, for example, getting treatment for cancer. You can't get cancer treatment inside a Palestinian hospital in the West Bank or the Gaza Strip because radiation therapy is not allowed because they consider it that it's too high risk for Israel's security. So everything from being able to get radiation therapy requires a security permit to be able to work inside Haifa or Nazareth or what have you, requires an Israeli security permit. And so now the cutting off of that security coordination collaboration doesn't just affect security, but it's also affecting civilians as well. So it is coming at a price. That being said, it needed to happen. It needed to happen because for far too long, the Palestinian Authority has fallen into this mode of somehow pretending that they're an independent government when it's not an independent government. It's the effect of in effect a municipal authority that doesn't even have control over anything beyond its municipal boundaries. And so that's something that needed to happen. So that's been the first step. The second step that they're talking about is what they call manifestation of a state on the ground. I'm not really sure what that means. I think that the bigger issue is a simple one. They should have been reassessing Oslo many moons ago. When they saw that it had failed in 1999, there should have been a reassessment of whether to continue with Oslo. There should have been a redirection of the way that political decision-making is made, the way that the Palestinian Authority economy is built, and they should have been breaking those ties with Israel, breaking that dependence with Israel. Now that we see that annexation is going to take shape, they really should start pushing for an anti-apartheid struggle rather than continuing with this facade of somehow pretending that they're a state, pushing for negotiations, and so on.
Mm-hmm. And Diana, you were mentioning a little bit earlier in terms of the consequences on people directly, people not being able to get cancer treatment because the coordination has ended. And it was remarkable that some media outlets reported that as somehow coming as a result of the actions of Palestinians themselves, ignoring the fact that the Israeli occupation was effectively holding Palestinians hostage, that either you collaborate with our effort to destroy your society, or if you refuse to collaborate, then we're going to prevent your own people from being able to get treatment. And the fact that this was spun to somehow be the Palestinians' responsibility, I thought was a little bit grotesque. And it's just something that is really worth keeping an eye on, is that whenever you see coverage of consequences of ending collaboration, to always remember the fact that Israel is an occupying power in the Palestinian territories. They are responsible for the well-being of Palestinians at the end of the day, until the day comes that the occupation ends. And you were also, there were many previous efforts, Josh, about bringing accountability for Israel. We were talking about accountability earlier, and we were talking about how Palestinians always pursued attempts that fell short of really trying to hold Israel accountable, under threat from the United States for the most part. If they ever tried to go to the ICC or the United Nations and trying to seek resolutions that put meaningful accountability pressure on Israel, that they would be punished for it. Now that that pretense has dropped of this entire conversation of a peace process and everything else, and we know that there have been some candidates for president earlier in the election before COVID destroyed the election, the entire news cycle, talk of real accountability for Israel. Do you see the prospect for that at this point? Do you still think that there is room for that moving forward? You're muted, Josh. Just want to make sure you notice.
Thanks. Absolutely. I do see that possibility ensuing. And in fact, I think it's worth bearing in mind that PLO, in fact, did go to the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and did suffer the consequences for doing so already. It was a congressional law in place which said that if the PLO went to the ICC to pursue war crimes allegations against Israel, then aid would be cut off, the PLO mission to the US would be cut off, and Trump did those things in response to those laws that were on the book. So I think that the ICC case is an extremely important mechanism for attempting to ensure Israeli accountability. It's going to be a very long and difficult road for sure, but I think the reactions that you've seen from Israel and its supporters and from the Trump administration in terms of what they have been doing in regard to the ICC is indicative of the seriousness of it. And it's also worth bearing in mind that not only is the ICC pursuing an investigation of Israel and its alleged war crimes in occupied Palestinian territory, but it's also doing the same thing regarding US actions in its war in Afghanistan. And so just a few weeks ago, the Trump administration actually placed harsh sanctions on ICC personnel who are pursuing either or both of these investigations. And what I posited in an article is that the Trump administration is trying to expound a political and legal doctrine of what I call dual exceptionalism, that everyone else should be held to international law standards and that these should apply to everyone across the board, except when it comes to the United States and Israel. That somehow, if there's an allegation that either the United States or Israel has committed a war crime, it must be politically motivated in the words of the Trump administration and slapping these sanctions on the ICC. So fighting back, pushing back against this dual exceptionalism that the United States and Israel are somehow immune to accountability for their actions is extremely important. Unfortunately, I think we need the support of people around the world. I really think there's little the United States can do, people in the United States can do regarding the ICC, since the United States has refused to join the international body from its inception.
You were mentioning the exception. It's funny how that gets turned over on its head. We have a situation where Israel is singled out for exceptional levels of military aid by the United States, singled out for an unprecedented number of vetoes at the UN so that they would never be held accountable for their actions that violate human rights, carrying out the longest modern occupation, engaging in ethnic cleansing, and effectively destroying a society. And whenever you talk about accountability for Israel, the first thing that comes up is, why are you singling Israel out for criticism, which is entirely absurd. Miko, here we are in the face of apartheid being declared out in the open. What do you think are how should the world react at this point? What do you anticipate in terms of world reaction right now? And what would you like to see? And I'm curious how likely you think that we will see something positive moving forward from here.
Well, you know, we have a 72-year history, and we can judge by what we've seen over the last 72 years as to what's going to happen. From time to time, the world wakes up, shake their finger at Israel for this or that or the other, and then goes back to its slumber, and Israel is allowed to continue doing whatever it wishes, and that's really been the way it's been for the last over 7 decades. It's been like this. The world wakes up one day and says, "Oh my God, that was terrible." A few UN resolutions, the Security Council convenes, and there's another resolution. And then everybody goes back to sleep and as though nothing happened. And then Israel does the next thing and the next thing. And before we know it, 7 decades have gone by and almost all of Palestine is taken by Israel. Monuments are destroyed. Entire populations are deprived of water, of rights, of travel, of life. And this is, I think, what we can expect as well. I mean, we're going to see a few people raise their eyebrows, perhaps another UN resolution demanding Israel cease and desist, but then things are going to go right back to normal. I don't think there's any reason to expect anything would be different. What I would like to see, of course, is the world embrace the world embrace boycott, divestment, and sanctions. That is the name. That is how it's done. When Israel is brought to its knees, it cannot go to the Olympics, cannot go to the World Cup, cannot participate in academic conferences, cannot participate in cultural conferences, when it is treated like the pariah that it should be treated, as it should be treated, and it's on its knees, then things will change. But until the world is willing to take that on and seriously demand sanctions and seriously impose boycotts and divest, I think we're going to see the same old thing. And you have to wonder, really, how far is it going to go? In other words, we already hear and see Israeli cabinet ministers, not to mention the U.S. ambassador, standing in front of big pictures of the holy sanctuary in Jerusalem without Al-Aqsa on it, with a Jewish temple on it. So are we waiting for that to actually happen? Is the world waiting for that to actually happen before boycott and sanctions are imposed? Because that's where it's going. They don't even try to hide it. It's not even, it used to be that people spoke about building a third temple where a bunch of fringe, religious crazies. Now these guys are sitting in the cabinet and speaking publicly about this. And again, the US ambassador was standing in front of a poster like Jinan is over there, except instead of the Golden Dome, there was this other strange thing that they envisioned. So again, I don't think there's any reason to expect any change, but I would love it if the world decided to take this on and embrace BDS.
Certainly there's a parallel there with the United States, where overt racism and white supremacy also seemed like a fringe segment of society, and now we finally are in a situation where it's coming directly from the White House, and it's incredibly a disturbing trend. Diana, just closing with you before we open it up to a question and answer segment. Miko's outlook is fairly pessimistic, that the most likely outcome is people criticizing, but then at the end of the day shrugging. What do you think are the prospects moving from here to create real accountability for Israel and moving things in a different direction?
I can't say I disagree, because I see the way that the world has behaved so far, and he's right. They have done nothing. There's the occasional shaking of the head, and then going back into the slumber, as he put it. That said, I think that there's something interesting about this moment, which is that the whole world now is watching, and the fact that Netanyahu even thought to do this in the open is waking people up from the slumber that they were in for quite some time. And it may just be that they go back to the slumber, but the fact that there is this attention that's being paid to the West Bank and to Israeli plans is saying something. The fact that there are some countries that, albeit who probably won't do anything, but that taboo has been broken. And now that we see that taboo has been broken around the idea of annexation, then so too the taboo can be broken around the idea of informal annexation and all of the other measures that they have been taking. So it's important for us to continue to press ahead. This would not have happened had it not been for the tireless efforts of people who've been pushing for BDS for, we're coming up on its 15th anniversary in a few days. And so we should be applauding ourselves for that while not taking our eyes off the ball. There are things that the world can do. They can enact the same measures that have been done vis-a-vis Crimea. Everything from imposing sanctions to halting trade with Israel, to, as Miko put it, get down to the minutia of making sure they're not in Eurovision, into the World Cup, into all of these things. But the fact that this conversation, that we're having this conversation and people are not just looking at July 1st with a big yawn, is saying something about the efforts of the BDS movement.
Could I add on to that, Omar?
Sure. Dive right in.
Yeah, I'm more optimistic like Diana is than pessimistic than Miko is on this regard. I think now is absolutely the right time to be pushing sanctions campaigns against Israel, to cut off the US funding to Israel. Even liberal Zionist organizations like J Street have said that if Israel annexes Palestinian land, that they will support conditioning US funding, which is a step in the right direction, although not nearly enough. And I think that there's a parallel to be drawn between this moment of annexation and the potential response to it versus what we've seen over the past month or so in the United States in response to the horrific killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Now, Police killing unarmed Black people is nothing new in this country, obviously. It's been going on systematically for centuries. So what about that particular killing, in addition to it being caught on videotape for all of the world to see, sparked this huge outpouring where we're really at a turning point where really millions of people in this country are starting to grapple with white supremacy and racism and thinking and talking and acting about ways to undo it. This is a transformation. And who could have expected that spark would lead to this? So I think that this is the history of all movements for social change. The spark for change always happens very unexpectedly and very quickly, but you lay the groundwork through education, through plans of action. And when the moment is ready, you have to be ready with those plans. And that means right now, being ready with the plans to impose military sanctions on Israel, because the conditions are ripe for that now.
Well said. Thank you all so much. I will hand it back to Jinan for the question and answer segment with the viewers.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Omar, and to our panelists. Really engaging and informative conversation. We are getting tons of questions in right now in the chat box, the Q&A box, and through Facebook. So I'll start with the first question. Please talk about the annexation movement, the anti-annexation movement in Israel.
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, you know, like Dana was saying, there's these two strands of thought in Israel. One says, let's be straightforward and, you know, not try to hide what our real intentions are and act quick. And the other is a little more hesitant to say, yes, we're going to do the exact same thing, only we're going to do it diplomatically. We're going to pretend that we want peace. We're going to pretend that, you know, we're reaching out, and of course, blame the Palestinians for when things fail. So to that extent, there is, you know, there are some people who are standing out there with signs saying no to annexation, no to the occupation. But in terms of their political strength, in terms of their ability to actually influence, they're not significant enough to actually bring about the kind of change that they want. And probably the main reason is that, number one, Netanyahu is determined, strong, and he's the smartest politician there. I mean, nobody comes close to him in terms of being a smart politician. He knows exactly how to play the game. The other thing is that the other side, which is the right bloc, are fierce. They are fierce. They are relentless. They are in everybody. Anybody even tries to hint at this annexation being somehow maybe ill-advised or too quick, they are at their throats. They just bring them down politically with tweets and articles and statements and interviews. So yeah, there is a small movement there. There are some voices calling, but they're mostly calling to wait, not so much calling to prevent it, but just calling to wait and do it in a more, you know, somehow more thoughtful manner.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so here's a question that came in through the chat. Don't you think that Trump's announcement of Jerusalem as Israel's capital is more dangerous than annexation? Or how do those two compare? Or do they not relate to each other at all?
Well, I think they're part of the same plan. This is like one step after the other. It's all part of the same, you know, step by step by step. That's the Trump plan, to give Israel everything it wants. And the demand that the Palestinians capitulate. It's all part of the same program.
Right. And so someone posted kind of like a follow-up to that. If Biden is elected, I mean, he's kind of already put his policies out on his website, saying that he's not going to move the embassy back. Also, he opposes BDS even in the context of like protected First Amendment speech. So if Biden is pressured, do you think that he would change some of his views on Israel and Palestine?
I'm happy to take a stab at that. Look, I think that Joe Biden is a big part of the problem at the end of the day, in the sense that, is he an improvement over Donald Trump when it comes to policy in Israel-Palestine? Of course, but that is really at an extremely low bar of somebody who's really taken us in a very difficult direction of, U.S. policy has long been one of enabling Israeli violence and aggression against Palestinians while claiming to oppose it. And Donald Trump came along and enthusiastically decided to make the United States a participant in Israel's war on Palestinian existence. And that's obviously an extremely disturbing shift. But Joe Biden is not taking us, if you say taking us back, he's taking us back to a point that is completely inadequate when it comes to the moment that we're in today. All of this talk of never applying any pressure on Israel, but merely trying to sweet talk them into respecting Palestinian rights or stopping settlement expansion or ending the occupation. This has already been tried for literally decades and has led to nothing but the further entrenchment of occupation and the further erosion of Palestinian life under Israeli control. So when somebody like Joe Biden says that he is fundamentally opposed to any proposal that conditions military aid to Israel, then he's effectively also a participant in Israel's annexation process, even if he pays lip service to the idea that he opposes it. And I think that it is going to be incredibly important when you look at where public opinion is on the Democratic side of the aisle at this point, that there is a really big swell to show the Democratic Party leadership that this is not what the party wants anymore. And it's they're the last to notice it. And I think that the pressure ought to be focused in that direction so that there is a positive shift. Do I envision that Joe Biden is going to be the person who, really applies meaningful enough pressure on Israel to fundamentally change the dynamic with Palestinians? Probably not, but still something is better than nothing. And I think any pressure applied in his direction to stop being complicit in Israel's apartheid is pressure that is very much worthwhile, if not for Biden himself, certainly for future elections in the United States.
Could I add into that, Jinan?
Go ahead, Josh. Yeah, absolutely.
In my book, Shattered Hopes, I wrote about how Biden went as vice president to give a speech in Detroit to a very, very large dinner of Jewish communal leaders and educators and rabbis. I think it was in 2012. This was after Netanyahu had slapped him in the face by announcing settlement expansion while he was visiting. And he gave a very emotion-laden speech in Detroit, and he talked about how, as a little child, his father sat him down around the kitchen table and explained to him about all the atrocities that were committed against Jewish people over the centuries and Christian complicity in that oppression. And that oppression obviously is very real. But he talked about how those talks with his father around the kitchen table really instilled in him a Zionist belief, what he called a Zionist belief. So like Omar said, he's a very old school Democratic politician who equates support for Zionism with somehow atoning for Christian guilt against previous Jewish oppression. He doesn't see it at all within the framework of Israel's oppression of the Palestinian people currently taking place. That's on the negative side of the ledger. On the positive side of the ledger, Joe Biden is a Teflon politician. He's not moored to any coherent set of political principles or philosophy that's undergirding his policies. And you can see how this played out in the Democratic primary this year. What happened right after Warren dropped out and Sanders dropped out? Suddenly, Joe Biden is adopting their proposals for universal health care, for getting rid of student debt, for reparations. He's adopting their progressive ideas that they were advocating for on the campaign trail. So to me, that's a positive thing, because that's a sign that, yes, he can be pushed by the base of the Democratic Party, and that if he makes a change in his policies, it won't be because he's suddenly found some morality or some political reality that he didn't previously know about. It's because the base of the Democratic Party is pushing him to make those changes.
And I'll add one little thing to that. I think, again, something Diana said earlier about reframing the struggle as anti-apartheid. I think if we stop talking about ending occupation and we start talking about anti-apartheid, number one, it's a much larger issue. and we're dealing with Palestinians who are outside of the West Bank as well. And I think it's time we started to do that, because all Palestinians are living under an apartheid regime, one or another. But it's also much easier to go against apartheid than to start understanding occupation. What is occupation? Where is it occupied? Where is not occupied? These are all kind of complicated issues. Apartheid across the board means it's an apartheid regime. It's wrong. We got to fight it. And I think if we do a good job in explaining that and pushing that forward, then again, there's a chance it goes up, up the chain of command. And at the end of the day, like Josh was saying, I mean, Biden will do whatever it takes to get elected. I mean, if we ever get to the point where in order to be elected, you have to support an anti-apartheid movement in Palestine, then that'd be great. And of course, he would sign on, I'm sure, because I don't believe that he has real principles.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so a couple of questions came in about this, so I'm just going to combine them. I think, Diana, you'd probably be best to answer this, but like, what's the probability of basically disbanding the PA, if that's even something that's practical to do? And if so, what would be the options for Palestinians if the PA was no longer around? And what if Israel was forced to take on the legal, moral, and financial obligation of the occupied territories?
Look, there's a lot of discussion about dismantling the PA, and for good reason. The PA has really only served as the cover for Israel for quite some time. And I say this as somebody who worked for them, who somehow believed that there was it was a different time, of course, that there was going to be freedom for Palestinians. The problem today with the Palestinian Authority is that it's taken on a life of its own, which is to say that this is an authority that today, while many think that it's doing good for Palestinians because it's the one that's providing hospitals and schools and employment and so on and so forth, it's doing this at an extreme political cost to Palestinian freedom. It does this only because it has to keep Israel somehow happy and the donor community happy. So Palestinian decision-making comes under the thumb and under the pressure of the international donor community. If the donors don't like what the Palestinian Authority is saying or doing, they cut off funds. And we saw this when, for example, when in 2006, we had our general elections and people overwhelmingly voted for Hamas. We saw that immediately the international community cut off funds to the Palestinian Authority. So today, when we look at the Palestinian Authority, while they think that it's some massive achievement, when in reality, it's not. All that it's doing is making sure it's providing a different address for the donors to pay salaries, a different address for the donors to pay for schools, a different address for the donors to be able to fund hospitals, rather than making that obligation Israel's, because it is Israel's obligation under international law. The prospects for it dismantling, there are two different levels. On the one hand, politically, they're not going to throw in the towel themselves. There's a lot of, they often claim that they will and they threaten that they will, but it's just empty threats. And I've heard this now, we've been hearing this now since 2009. But on the flip side is that we're now seeing that there is a great deal of financial constraint that's being placed on the Palestinian Authority. And I don't think that it's going to be in a place where it's going to be able to function in anytime soon. And so this is why I think in terms of your second part of the question, which is options if it's not around, this is where we need to start planning and thinking. There are other options. There is the PLO, which does need to be very seriously reformed, but we don't need to be confined to either or option. And I think that we really need to start putting into place a strategy that makes sure that we are able to survive in our own country, that makes sure that we're able to resist in our own country, and that makes sure that we put forward a vision for the future. This requires bringing the minds together, and we have plenty of them to do it. But if we just hide our head in the sand and say that the Palestinian Authority is the greatest achievement, which is what I hear, by the way, in the West Bank, then we're cutting off our noses to spite our faces.
Thank you very much for addressing that. Another question that came in, are we anticipating any violence in the upcoming week in Palestine because of this annexation?
Well, Diana, you're in Palestine.
Yeah, I was just going to say, maybe I should answer because I'm in Palestine. I think that's the wrong way of thinking of things. You know, oftentimes when I meet with diplomats and with journalists, they condemn something because it leads to one of two things. They either say this is going to lead to regional instability, or it's going to lead to violence, like one of the two, right? And for me, it doesn't have to be either of those things. Can't we just condemn it because it's wrong, because it's illegal, because it's immoral? Instead of saying, well, it's only worthy of condemnation if it leads to violence, or it's only worthy of condemnation if it leads to regional instability. Do I expect that there's going to be violence? Heck yes. The Israelis are going to go nuts. The settlers are going to go nuts. They've already been going nuts. I was in the Palestinian town of Burin just last week. The day before I was there, Israeli settlers burned down orchards in Burin. 2 days after I left, they burned down the rest of the orchards in Burin. So yes, there is going to be a lot of violence because the Israelis are letting the settlers loose to do whatever it is that they want to do. But I think that usually when the question is asked in the opposite way of is it that are Palestinians going to go? Are there going to be protests? Are there not going to be protests? That doesn't matter. What we should be doing is we should be protesting because it's wrong for us, and that's why we should be putting our feet down.
You know, I'd add to that. Israel is engaging in violence on a regular basis constantly. The very existence of Israel is violence. I mean, let's put the West Bank aside for a second. You know, the Nakab Desert, 200,000 Palestinian citizens of Israel living without access to water or electricity. Their homes are being demolished at an unbelievable rate, or if you can call these things home. They've been pushed into living in horrible conditions and in overcrowded conditions without access to electricity, water, the great healthcare, you name it. You know, we're not talking about Gaza, we're talking about citizens of Israel. Palestinians who live in the triangle area, in the Muthalaf, the same thing. Horrible conditions, home demolitions, East Jerusalem, the same thing. Israeli violence is everywhere. Every checkpoint is violence. Every time Palestinians are denied water, which happens all the time, and we're talking about millions of people, is that not violence? The actual existence of Israel, 5.5 million Palestinians languishing in refugee camps, that is not violence because Israel has denied them the right to return to their homes. All of that is violence. Israel is engaged in violence all the time. And I just heard an interview with Saeb Erekat. He gave an interview to one of the Israeli TV stations. And they're asking, that's the first question the Israelis are coming out. So can we expect another intifada? Can we expect more suicide bombers, more violence? That's the question? You that are representing the most violent aspect in Palestine, you're the one who are asking the Palestinians if they're going to engage in violence. They don't even have the means to engage in violence. They don't have an army. They don't have a military force. But that is the construct. That is how people view it. It's always in a kind of a, you know, the paradigm is a pro-Israeli paradigm. That's always the issue. The issue is not whether or not the PA should do this, that, or the other, is why is there a PA anyway, and why are Palestinian Authority limited to those small areas? Why isn't there a Palestinian Authority all of Palestine, you know, that will allow to bring a real change? So, you know, I think it's kind of incumbent upon us to help people make that transition from thinking about the good Israel doing something wrong to the reality where Israel is the thing that is wrong in Palestine, and therefore it has to be an anti-apartheid movement, and therefore boycott, divestment, and sanctions are needed. It's to prevent the violence.
No, all good points. Thank you so much. Question came in, what is the expected impact on Palestinians who live in the annexation areas?
I can speak to that if you'd like. Look, already we're seeing a few things. We've already seen that in certain parts of the West Bank that the Israeli army has taken down signs. You know, you've all seen these signs where it says, you're entering into a Palestinian area, this is dangerous for your life, all of this, you know, whatever. Those signs in some parts of the West Bank are already being taken down. And the message that's being sent to them is that annexation has begun. A sign is just a sign. The other things that are happening, though, are much more important. It's everything from we've already seen an increase in home demolitions in those areas where the Israelis have already put out the test balloon of annexation. We've already seen more home demolitions. We've seen that there's been more movement restrictions in those areas as well. And we're seeing that there's a lot more settler violence, as I had already mentioned, in various places, including Burin and Beta and other areas as well. So that's the stuff that we're already seeing. What I expect to see in the coming weeks is more of the same. I think that by pushing this plan, it sends the green light to the settlers that they can do whatever it is that they want to do, and it continues to send the green light to the army that they can do whatever it is that they want to do. And so we'll continue to see more and more homes being demolished in those areas, more attempts to remove Palestinians from their land, and more checkpoints, and certainly a lot more settler violence. This is what I expect to happen. If there's some people who believe that somehow there's going to be citizenship granted, that's never going to happen. Israelis have already indicated that it won't happen. Instead, as Miko said, it will be you either put your head down, accept your fate in life, or you will either be killed or removed.
And and I think another thing that we're going to see is a lot more building of Israeli settlements, because one of the advantages that this annexation has for the settlers is that building, once it's annexed, once it's Israeli sovereignty has been put in place, building settlements in that area doesn't have to go all the way to the Prime Minister's office, and it's not a governmental thing, it's a local, council decision. So it's a lot easier for them to build. It's a lot easier for them to get permits to build. And so, and like I said, already the Jordan River Valley has already become part of the consensus that it's not really occupied, it's not really the West Bank, and living there is kind of cool anyway. So they're going to be building a lot more, and of course displacing a lot more Palestinians, and using this land, which is, as far as I know, and Dan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, it provides a lot of the agriculture produce for the West Bank is actually grown in that area. I heard 50%. I don't know if that's true, but it's fertile. It's good land. They want it for themselves. They want it for the settlements. They want it for themselves. So we're going to see a lot more building of settlements and a lot more displacing of Palestinians, without a doubt.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think also what we're seeing is a logical continuation of the unilateralism that was in evidence during the George W. Bush administration and the Sharon government in Israel versus today Trump administration and Netanyahu. And not to say that under Democratic administrations, the policies were any better, but of course there was an effort to actually attempt to have a facade of engaging the Palestinians, which may or may not be better, arguably. But the point I'm trying to make is that according to some reports, the Trump administration is going to go back to the letter that Bush gave Sharon back in 2004, 2005, where Bush basically green-lighted the annexation of major settlement blocks to Israel, and that Trump is going to use this as a precedent for enabling the Israeli annexation this time around. So, this notion that the United States colluding with Israel to try to impose something on the Palestinian people, especially with regard to annexation, is definitely not new.
Thank you for that. Okay, I have a question that says, since the balance of political, economic, and military power supports the continuation of mass repression of Palestine, aside from the popular BDS movement, what other active base of power is available to counter the US-Israeli crimes and bring any semblance of a united Palestinian-Israeli democracy?
Well, I'll throw in one.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's electoral work here in the United States. It's incredibly important who is in Congress making these decisions about our policy toward the issue. And as we saw in the 16th Congressional District of New York last week, where Jamal Bowman upset Eliot Engel in the primary race, I can't overstress the importance of this apparent victory. And I say apparent because they still have to count the absentee ballots. Eliot Engel, for those who may not be familiar with him, is the current chair of the House Foreign Relations Committee. And in that position, he is the primary person responsible for moving forward in Congress legislation protecting Israeli apartheid over the Palestinian people. His removal in itself is significant, but the fact that his old school democratic style of love for Israel and complete ignorance and ignoring of Palestinian rights, him being replaced by a person who sees parallels between how the United States oppresses Black people and how Israel oppresses the Palestinian people, who has already called for conditioning aid funding to Israel, who has already called for opposing annexations by restricting funding. That is just such a monumental shift in the Democratic Party. And to have more people elected like him and more people defeating people like Eliot Engel is going to lead to significant policy changes in the future.
There is a related note within the U.S., if I can comment on that as well. There is a battle. I mean, there is, look, the balance of shift within the United States is changing. And I think that the writing is on the wall in a way that the Israel lobby and a lot of groups that support Israeli policies are beginning to notice the significant shift in public opinion, especially with younger people, more diverse constituencies. They know where things are heading. And so right now there is a very significant fight over the right to free speech on the question of Israel and Palestine in the United States. There was an effort to expand the definition of anti-Semitism so that it includes criticism of Israel. And that was an explicit attempt at curtailing criticism of Israel so that students who attempt to engage in pro-Palestine advocacy are somehow tarred with that label. The bill was called the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, and thankfully it was successfully defeated recently. But then when the Trump administration came to power, Donald Trump signed an executive order that effectively expands the definition of anti-Semitism to include criticism of Israel. So we got stuck in the same situation. There's efforts on college campuses. There's a man by the name of Ken Marcus who used to bring lawsuits under the Obama administration against the Department of Education, saying that Palestinian students engaging in pro-Palestine activism on campus are creating a climate of intimidation for Jewish students. And thankfully, the Department of Civil Rights of the Department of Education under Obama kept shooting down those efforts, saying this doesn't make any sense. What's happening on campus is protected political speech. It's not anti-Jewish harassment. And they were tossing these cases out. And Ken Marcus was bragging about the fact that even though those cases were being tossed out, that he was contributing to a climate where students were afraid to engage in quote unquote anti-Israel behavior on campus. Donald Trump comes along and then puts Ken Marcus as the head of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Education, effectively putting him in charge of the department that was protecting students from his infringement on their right to free speech. And there are efforts all over the United States of pushing bills that criminalize participation in boycotts of Israel, which are completely unconstitutional. It's the right to engage in boycotts is protected by the First Amendment of the Constitution, and you have all these legal battles being fought all over the country over this. And I think that we have to be vigilant about the fact that the other side knows it can't win the argument anymore. They know that they cannot defend the indefensible. And therefore, they are turning to shutting down our ability to talk honestly about what is actually unfolding in Israel and Palestine. And I think that that's a fight that is absolutely worth engaging in.
Yeah, I want to add a little something to that as well. You know, in the UK, the Labour Party looked really, really promising. And I was in the UK several times during the Labour Party conferences, and you had the feeling that you had a pro-Palestine rally. I mean, the main hall, everybody was carrying Palestinian flags. There was all these resolutions were being passed. They were very positive, kind of showing solidarity with the cause for freedom and so forth for Palestinians. And then the Labour Party collapsed. Jeremy Corbyn lost. The whole thing fell apart. And the man who's taking credit for that is a man by the name of Gilad Erdan, who was the Israeli Minister for Strategic Affairs and is soon to become the Israeli ambassador both to the US and to the United Nations, which means he's bringing the fight home. He's bringing the fight over here, which means all those things that, Omar, you just discussed and are extremely important, and the stuff that Josh brought up that are extremely important, are going to be met even more viciously with this guy, and I'm sure he was brought here for that reason. It's not, you know, it's not just a random decision to bring him and place him in these two very, very important roles as ambassador both in the UN and the United States. I've been kind of looking into and studying a little bit. I had a panel about the just how meticulous the pro-Israeli groups are in influencing the textbooks in the public schools in America. And it is shocking. It is absolutely shocking the amounts of money, the amounts of effort, and for how many years they have been working diligently, state by state, county by county, on influencing the textbooks in high school, textbooks in the public school system. So that when we get to the point where we're having these conversations with people running for office or people who are kind of in influential positions, you know, they've already studied this in high school. They studied it in civil, you know, in middle school. They studied it at university. They heard about this in the churches and the synagogues, which of course makes it much tougher for us to make our case. So I would just remind everybody to take a good close at what Erdogan does once he takes office here, and also take a good close look at what is happening in the U.S. and different communities in the public schools and what they're teaching, and whenever possible to interfere and to intervene and to stop them.
Thank you. Okay, so this question is about the international response. So what has been the international response, specifically the EU, as well as the Arab and Muslim nations? What has been said, what has not? Someone mentioned in the question that Egypt has decided not to say anything because they don't want to jeopardize the relationship with the United States. Are there any other examples similar to that?
Well, the UN is you know, the UN Human Rights High Commissioner has condemned it. King Abdullah in Jordan has come out against the Trump plan, which I thought was very interesting, and I've got to say, courageous. And he's also come out very clearly against this annexation. He's speaking about it, and he's talking about perhaps downgrading the diplomatic relations with Israel, which is not something I think most of us would have expected to see. And I think that's got some significance. Israel, the head of the Mossad just flew to Amman to just talk to him, because he and Netanyahu obviously can't sit in the same room together. So he sent the head of the Mossad to talk to the King Abdullah to maybe calm him down a little bit. But those are the things that I've been paying attention to, that I've been seeing.
There was a meeting a little bit over a month ago of some of the major of the European countries, and 21 of the foreign ministers who are both part of Europe, and then also donors to the Palestinian Authority attended. And these 21 foreign ministers all came out condemning this annexation plan. So we've seen it from various levels, from the UN, the Secretary General of the UN, to these various countries around like Europe. We've seen other countries either stay mealy-mouthed, like the UAE, or come out strongly against. I think the important thing is that there's only been one country which is for, and that's the United States. And that's what I think is important for people to keep in mind, is that we're now seeing a world where it is the entire world on one side, and then Israel and the United States on the other side. And that part is very important. Now, what is it that they can do? They can do a lot. It's just that there's a lot of people that are standing in disbelief that this is going to actually happen. One thing they can do is, as Miko said, is impose sanctions. They can actually go down the path of supporting sanctions. If you look at, for example, what the EU did when it came to Crimea, they did everything from banning imports to halting investment to stopping EU tourism in Crimea, to putting people on the sanctions list, to putting entities on the sanctions list. All of this is possible, but it requires political will. We're just now on the cusp of that political will, but we have to keep pushing for it to happen. And we have to keep highlighting that we have, on the one hand, Israel and the United States, and on the other hand, the entire rest of the world.
Thank you so much. So we're just after 3 o'clock. So one last question to our panelists. So obviously we're all, most of us watching right now are here in the United States, and a lot of people are asking what they can do realistically right now as individuals or as activists or as academics to help either like push the conversation forward, or actionables that they can do in order to try to stop this annexation, or at least, have some sort of like an impact on how it plays out. So what are some final thoughts on that?
Nobody wants to. Go ahead, Josh.
Thanks, Miko. Yeah, I think we have to be realistic. I mean, I actually don't think that there's anything me or you or anyone watching this webinar can do that's going to stop Israeli annexation. The decision of what land and when to annex will be a decision that's made between the Trump administration and within the divisions between the Israeli government. That being said, I do think it is a very important time to be vocal, to be active about this very blatant act of Israeli apartheid that is now evident for everyone to see, whether they accepted or denied it over the past 7 decades. It depends where you are. It depends what your situation is. I mean, look, boycott and divestment efforts are great. They're extremely important, but we also need to get to the S. We need to get to sanctions, because, as much as we've seen Israel and Gilad Erdan and the Israel lobby in the United States push back against college level efforts to pass divestment resolutions and boycott resolutions, to be honest, that's really small potatoes when it comes to talking about the $3.8 billion Israel gets in funding from US taxpayers every year. So for me, the battle lines, the proverbial battle lines are clear. This is a fight to impose sanctions on Israel, and we need to advocate in every arena possible, and especially with our elected officials, that now is the time to impose sanctions on Israel by cutting off US funding.
Something that Josh, that you said earlier made me think, what happened in America, we all saw those 8 minutes and 46 seconds where George Floyd was literally had the life just sucked out of him. And that was a moment that changed everybody. And suddenly, people who never heard of Juneteenth are now out there talking about, you know what I mean? I mean, it really, it could be, I know my predictions earlier were pessimistic. It could be that this annexation would be that moment, where people notice this, and this would be that moment that would wake people up and say, wait, what are they doing? I think, though, again, it's important for those of us who are out there talking and are being asked the question to remind people this annexation is one small part of a much greater problem. Again, it's not a good Israel doing something bad. There's a serious problem. The problem is Israel. The problem is that Palestine has been under an apartheid regime for 72 years. Palestinians, whether if they're in the camps, they're languishing for no fault of their own. They should be allowed to return. Palestinians who have this quasi-citizenship of Israel are being denied water, being denied education, being denied healthcare, or having their homes destroyed and their lands taken away. Again, we talked about what is happening in the West Bank. Never mind 2 million people, over 2 million people in the Gaza Strip, in a cage, in a prison. This is a big problem, and this annexation is one more step that this apartheid regime is taking in order to further its larger agenda. So we need to be talking about this. Definitely, we need to do everything we can to stop it and fight it. There's no question about that. However, in our discussions, we need to open up the issue to the broader issue and remind people we need to do all of these things. And the fight is, in a way, like Josh said, it's the battleground. The fight is a much bigger fight. It goes far beyond this particular thing because it's going to probably happen or not happen regardless of what we do at this particular moment. But we can stop, if we organize properly, we can stop this entire monstrosity that has taken over Palestine if we organize and we think strategically and we work together.
I can jump in on this real quick as well. I just want to comment on something that Josh said a little bit earlier, and it really, to me, it's a question of framing on, you don't even need to get to sanctions because the $3.8 billion that the US gives Israel, that's not an Israeli entitlement. That's not an Israeli right that we're asking for a punishment of. It's not punishment for Israel to end American complicity in occupation and apartheid. And it's the same with the vetoes at the United Nations. If you say that the US should not use its veto to protect Israel from accountability, that's not really a punishment for Israel. That's just ending American complicity. And so I think that, even if you might get some pushback on the question of sanctions, is it the right move or not? We're merely talking about ending the privileges that Israel receives to carry out violence against Palestinians. And as far as sort of what people can do, I think there are two games happening at once, and I think that they're both very important. And I think that a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that one is important and the other is negligible. But to me, at the end of the day, that's okay, because as long as people are devoted to both, it's good. There's the long game, which is the work of education and movement building and intersectional solidarity, and building the kind of world where apartheid won't exist. And that is a very long game that has to be played, and we have to build that kind of future. But that is not an alternative to engaging in the short-term struggles in the meantime of working, as Josh pointed out, on elections, of working on congressional advocacy, of engaging with the media on a regular basis, of never letting a story go on a media outlet if it conveys the facts inaccurately, if it portrays the victims as the perpetrators and vice versa. I think every single instance of those is that instead of simply complaining on social media about how things are unfair, actually take the time to write to the media outlet and, a letter to the editor or an op-ed or things like that, just making sure that we're visible constantly. That's the kind of thing that's going to contribute meaningfully to a shift in public discourse that leads to that movement coming sooner. And as Miko mentioned earlier, you never know what incident ends up triggering that, finally hitting that tipping point where things really fundamentally change. And we just, even if we don't know when that moment is and what it's going to ultimately take to make that shift, to not let that dissuade us from working tirelessly day in and day out to bring it about, because I think it is inevitable. We are going to see it eventually.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Omar, because we have seen the discourse change a lot. I mean, growing up and being a very active, Palestinian American, seeing how things have shifted from more just protesting on the streets and now focusing on, Congress, and as Josh said, focusing on elected officials and making sure you're voting the right people in and you're holding your representatives accountable. All of that goes into play because it really doesn't matter if it's a Republican or Democratic president. I've told multiple people that over the years, because a lot of people really think that that's the only thing that gets things done, but really it's your elected officials and even your city councils, your state representatives, because we have seen that anti-BDS laws have been passed in 26 states, and that's at the state level. And so you need to make sure that you are, holding accountable your state and your local representatives, not just the federal representatives. Okay, any other final thoughts before we close? Okay, I'd like to thank all of our panelists and Omar for moderating the conversation and also participating in the Q&A. I want to thank everybody who tuned in. Seems like we had a few hundred people who were watching this, sending in questions. We couldn't get to all of the questions, but hopefully the conversation was able to address a lot of your questions. And to all of the ADC supporters, we appreciate you, our board, as well as my staff who works tirelessly behind the scenes to help me put on these webinars. I want to thank them as well. Again, reach out to us. Let us know if there's anything that ADC can do for you, any topics that you would like to see us discuss, and go to our website, become a member, become a supporter. We need you guys now more than ever while we're working from home and keeping each other safe. Thanks again, and hope everyone has a great afternoon and a good week ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks.